There is something you did or did not do that you have not fully forgiven yourself for. You may have told yourself you have. You have said the right things to yourself about it. You understand intellectually that everyone makes mistakes. You know that the past cannot be changed. You have moved forward by every external measure, and the thing is still there. Not as a constant presence you have managed that much, but as a returned guest. Arriving in the quiet in the middle of the night, in the moments between tasks when the management of it relaxes and it slips back through the gap. Real self-forgiveness, not the performed kind, not the version that satisfies the social requirement of having processed a thing and moved on, but the genuine, felt, physiologically settled release of the verdict against yourself, is one of the most difficult and most important things a human being can achieve. It is difficult because genuine self-forgiveness requires something more demanding than the declaration of forgiveness. It requires the honest engagement with what happened, what it means, and what genuine accountability for it actually looks like, separate from the punishment that the guilt has been administering and calling accountability. This audiobook is about that distinction, about the difference between guilt that serves growth and guilt that serves only itself, about what you actually owe the people you have harmed, to yourself, and to the person you are trying to become, and about the specific, honest, philosophically serious practice of giving yourself the second chance that you have been either denying or performing but not actually receiving. Part 1. The difference between guilt and shame. The psychologist June Price Tangney spent decades studying guilt and shame and found something that is both simple and enormously consequential for anyone who carries either. Guilt and shame feel similar from the inside. Both are painful emotional responses to the perception that you have done something wrong. But they differ in a fundamental way that determines almost everything about what they produce in the person experiencing them. Guilt says, I did a bad thing. The bad thing is located in the behavior, the choice, the action or inaction. The self remains separate from the verdict. And because the self is separate, the guilt contains within it the seeds of its own resolution. It motivates the acknowledgement of the wrong, the repair of the damage where possible, the changed behavior going forward. Guilt, when it is proportionate and properly handled, is a genuinely constructive emotion. It is the conscience doing its job. It points at something real, prompts the appropriate response, and releases when that response has been made. Shame says, I am a bad thing. The verdict is not located in the behavior but in the self, and because the self is the verdict, there is no repair available. The behavior can be changed, the damage can be addressed, the apology can be made, but if the shame remains, none of these things resolve it, because the thing being condemned is not what was done. It is who you are. And who you are cannot be undone the way a behavior can be changed or an apology can be made. The shame loops. It returns. It compounds. It eats. Tangney's research showed that shame, unlike guilt, is strongly associated with poor outcomes. More anger, more defensiveness, less empathy for the people harmed, and paradoxically less motivation to make genuine amends. The shamed person is not more accountable. They are more self-occupied, absorbed in the pain of their own condemnation in a way that leaves less capacity for the genuine attention to the people they harmed that actual accountability requires. Shame is the enemy of genuine repair. It feels like accountability, and it produces the opposite. Understanding this distinction changes the relationship to the verdict you have been running against yourself. When you examine the thing you have not forgiven yourself for, the specific mistake, the specific harm, the specific failure, and you ask honestly, am I carrying guilt or shame? Am I condemning the choice or condemning the self? The answer points directly to what genuine resolution actually requires. Guilt can be resolved through the proportionate acknowledgement and repair that it motivates. Shame can only be resolved by dismantling the verdict against the self, which is a different and deeper undertaking. The first act of genuine self-forgiveness is the separation of the deed from the doer. Not as exoneration, the deed was real, the harm was real, the accountability remains. but as the foundational recognition that the person who made that choice is not reducible to that choice. That the choice was made by a version of you that existed in specific circumstances, with specific knowledge, under specific pressures, with specific limitations, and that version is not all there is of you, and its verdict is not the final word on who you are. Part 2. What genuine accountability actually requires. The guilt that does not resolve itself is usually guilty of a specific error. It has confused the ongoing punishment of the self with the genuine accountability that the harm required. It continues to administer the sentence long after the sentence has served any constructive purpose, not because the punishment is producing anything useful, but because stopping it feels like letting yourself off the hook. And letting yourself off the hook feels, to the guilt, like the abandonment of the accountability that the harm genuinely deserved. But genuine accountability is not self-punishment. Self-punishment and accountability look similar from the outside. Both involve the person acknowledging that something wrong was done, but they are fundamentally different in their orientation. Self-punishment is oriented toward the self, toward the administration of pain that matches the pain caused, toward the maintenance of a verdict that satisfies the internal demand for justice. Genuine accountability is oriented toward the other, toward the actual person or people harmed, toward what they need, toward what repair is possible, toward the changed behavior that ensures the harm is not repeated. The psychologist Fred Luskin, whose research on forgiveness we encountered in an earlier discussion, describes genuine accountability as a three-part process: the honest acknowledgement of what happened and what harm it caused, the making of amends where possible and appropriate, and the changed behavior going forward. Each of these is directed outward, toward the reality of what happened and its consequences, rather than inward toward the punishment of the self. When these three things have been genuinely done, when the acknowledgement has been honest, the amends have been made where they can be made, and the behavior has genuinely changed, the guilt has served its purpose. Continuing it past that point is no longer accountability. It is self-flagellation wearing accountability's costume. There are situations in which amends cannot be made. People who are no longer alive to receive the apology. Relationships that have ended beyond the point of contact. Harm done to people whose welfare would not be served by reopening the wound. In these cases, the accountability takes a different form, not the direct repair of the specific relationship, but the honest internal acknowledgement of the wrong, and the carrying forward of the lesson in the way you engage with every relationship that follows. The changed behavior is the amends. The genuine transformation of the person who made the mistake is the most complete accountability available when the direct repair is not. The question that breaks the guilt loop is this: have I done everything that genuine accountability actually required? Not everything the guilt demands. The guilt will demand indefinitely and will not be satisfied by any finite amount of payment. Everything that genuine accountability, oriented toward the actual harm and the actual people affected, actually required. If the honest answer is yes, the acknowledgement was made, the repair was attempted or accepted as impossible, the behavior has changed, then continuing the punishment is not serving the people you harmed. It is serving only the guilt's need to continue. If the honest answer is no, if there is something that genuine accountability still requires that has not been done, then the path is not self-forgiveness yet. It is the completion of the accountability, the conversation not yet had, the amends not yet offered, the behavior not yet genuinely changed. Doing these things is harder than the continued self-punishment, which requires nothing of you except the ongoing endurance of the pain. But the genuine accountability completed produces what the self-punishment never can: the actual release, the actual resolution, the actual second chance. Part 3. The philosophy of the fallible self. Every tradition of moral philosophy that has taken human limitations seriously has arrived, in its own language, at a version of the same recognition. Human beings make mistakes, not occasionally, not only in their worst moments, not only before they develop sufficient wisdom. Perpetually, inevitably, as a fundamental feature of what it is to be a finite creature, navigating a world of genuine complexity with genuinely limited information, genuinely limited self-knowledge, and genuinely limited capacity for the foresight that would prevent every harm before it occurs. The Stoics were particularly attentive to this. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in his private journal, about his own failures of patience, of wisdom, of the standard he had set for himself, with a frankness about human fallibility that is striking from someone who held the most powerful position in the ancient world. He did not write about these failures as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. He wrote about them as the ordinary, expected, entirely survivable evidence of the continuing work of becoming better. The failure was not a verdict. It was data. The question was not how to punish the self that had failed. It was what could be learned from this failure that would make tomorrow's engagement slightly more aligned with the person he intended to be. The Buddhist concept of karma is often misunderstood in popular Western usage as a system of cosmic punishment. What you do to others will be done to you. In its more philosophically careful form, it is something quite different. The recognition that every action has consequences, that the character you are in this moment is the accumulated result of the choices you have made in every previous moment, and that the most important question is not what you did then, but what you are choosing now. The past action cannot be undone. The present action is still fully yours, and the present action, chosen well, is the only genuine response to the past action that was not. The existentialist tradition, particularly Sartre, would add something important to this. The person who made the mistake is not the same person who is conducting the reckoning with it. Time has passed. Experience has accumulated. Understanding has developed. The version of you that made the choice existed in a specific moment with specific consciousness and specific limitations. The version of you now is genuinely different, not entirely, not in the most fundamental aspects of character, but in the specific knowledge and perspective that the intervening time has provided. To hold the current self entirely accountable to the limitations of the earlier version is a category error. It mistakes the person who made the mistake for the person who is doing the forgiving. This is not a license for the avoidance of accountability. It is a philosophical clarification of what accountability actually means. The current self is accountable for taking seriously what the earlier self did, for learning from it, for making the repairs it can make, for carrying forward the changed behavior that genuine learning produces. The current self is not accountable for being punished indefinitely for the limitations of a version of itself that no longer exactly exists. The ongoing punishment of the current self for the failures of the past self is not justice. It is a confusion of persons. The fallible self is the only kind of self available. The perfect self, the one that would never have made the mistake, that would have known better, that would have chosen differently, does not exist and has never existed. It is a standard that was constructed after the fact, from the vantage point of knowing what the consequences were, and applied retroactively to a moment in which that knowledge was not available. The honesty of self-forgiveness requires the acknowledgement that the person who made the choice was doing so in the only way available to them, with the consciousness, the information, the emotional resources, and the judgment that they actually had. Not the judgment they should have had, the judgment they had. Part 4. The stories we tell to keep ourselves guilty. The guilt that does not release is maintained by a story, not the honest account of what happened and what it cost. That account is necessary and appropriate. The story that wraps around the honest account and extends the verdict indefinitely. The story that says you are the kind of person who does that, that says you proved something about yourself that day that cannot be undisputed, that says the people who were harmed are still harmed, and your continued guilt is the least you can offer in response to that fact. These stories are very convincing. They have a moral quality that makes them feel like integrity rather than self-punishment. The person who no longer feels guilty about the harm they caused that person, the story says, would be callous, unfeeling, insufficiently aware of the ongoing consequences of what they did. The guilt is positioned as the only appropriate feeling. Its continuation is positioned as the only honest response, and giving it up is positioned as giving up on the accountability that the people harmed deserved. But this story has a specific beneficiary, and it is not the people who were harmed. It is the guilt itself. Guilt, particularly the chronic, looping, unresolvable kind, becomes its own psychological system, a way of relating to the self that, however painful, provides a kind of structure, a clear moral position, the person who hurts someone paying for it, a familiar emotional state that, however unpleasant, is at least known. A story about the self that, however unflattering, is at least settled. The release of the guilt requires giving up all of these, the moral clarity, the familiar state, the settled story, in favor of the genuinely uncertain position of the person who has done wrong, has done what they can to address it, and must now live forward without the familiar weight of the verdict. The psychologist Kristen Neff, whose research on self-compassion is among the most rigorously developed in the field, has documented that people who are highly self-critical are not more ethical than those who extend themselves compassion. They are less so. The self-criticism consumes cognitive and emotional resources that would otherwise be available for the genuine moral attention to others that ethical behavior requires. The person drowning in self-reproach is, paradoxically, more self-focused than the person who has genuinely forgiven themselves. The guilt, dressed as the ultimate acknowledgement of the other person's pain, is actually the most thoroughly self-centered emotional state available. The story that keeps the guilt running needs to be examined with the same honesty that the original mistake deserves. Who is the continued guilt serving? Has it served the people harmed? Has it actually done anything for them, beyond the acknowledgement and any repair you have been able to make? Or has it served primarily the internal demand for a proportionate punishment? Has it changed your behavior going forward, or has it simply persisted as emotional experience while the behavior has already been addressed? And is it, in its continued operation, actually preventing you from being the person who can do better? By consuming the resources of attention, clarity, and forward engagement that genuine growth requires. The honest answers to these questions do not always point immediately to release. Sometimes they reveal that there is still genuine accountability work to do, still amends to be made, still behavior to be changed. Do that work. It is the most direct path to the release the guilt is blocking. But sometimes the honest answers reveal that the work has been done and the guilt has stayed anyway, has become habitual, structural, a part of the self-concept that the self is now defending rather than genuinely maintaining for moral reasons. In that case, the continuation is a choice, and like all choices, it can be made differently. Part 5. The practice of genuine self-forgiveness. Genuine self-forgiveness is not a single act. It is not a decision made in a moment of resolution and then done. It is a practice, the ongoing, daily, sometimes effortful returning to the position of the person who has acknowledged what happened, done what genuine accountability required, and chosen to stop administering the punishment that the guilt has been insisting upon. Like all practices, it requires repetition. The guilt will return, particularly in the beginning. The practice is not the prevention of its return. It is the response when it returns. The first element of the practice is the clear account, writing out, not as self-criticism but as genuine narrative, what actually happened, what choices were made, what the circumstances were, what information was available, what the person making the choice was feeling and believing and capable of in that moment. Not to excuse the choice, but to locate it accurately in the reality of what it was. A choice made by a specific person in specific circumstances with specific limitations. The clear account removes the abstraction that makes the guilt eternal. The abstract guilty self, condemned for an undefined failure of character, can be condemned indefinitely. The specific person who made a specific choice in specific circumstances is a real and finite subject, one whose accountability has specific, completable requirements. The second element is the explicit completion of accountability. The honest answer to the question, have I done what genuine accountability actually required? The acknowledgement, the repair, the changed behavior. If any of these have not been done, doing them is the practice. Not because they will extinguish the guilt automatically. Guilt is not always rational in its responses to rational actions, but because they complete the genuine moral obligation. And the completion of the genuine moral obligation removes the guilt's legitimate claim. What remains after that is not accountability. It is habit. The Tibetan Buddhist practice of Tonglen, the meditation in which the practitioner breathes in pain and breathes out relief, taking in suffering and sending out ease, can be adapted as a self-forgiveness practice. In this adaptation, the practitioner brings to mind the person they harmed, holds them with genuine compassion, breathes in the full awareness of the harm that was caused, and breathes out the genuine wish for their well-being and healing. This practice is not comfortable. It is not the avoidance of the harm or the minimization of it. It is the full encounter with it, held in compassion rather than in the armor of continued guilt. And in the full encounter, without the armor, something that the armor was preventing often becomes available. The third element is the self-compassion practice. The specific, deliberate extending to yourself of the same quality of understanding and care that you would, without hesitation, extend to a close friend who came to you with the same mistake, the same guilt, the same inability to release the verdict against themselves. You would not tell your friend that they deserve to carry this forever. You would not tell them that the continued pain serves any genuine moral purpose. You would hear what happened, acknowledge the harm, affirm the genuine accountability they have already demonstrated, and gently, directly, with full sincerity tell them, you have paid what was owed. You are allowed to move forward. What comes next matters more than continued punishment. That conversation, offered to yourself, in whatever quiet you can find, with the full sincerity that you would bring to a friend who needed it, is the beginning of the actual second chance. Not the performance of a second chance while the verdict continues to run underneath. The genuine offering to the self that made the mistake and has accounted for it as genuinely as it was able, of the release that every human being who has done what they could to address what they did wrong both deserves and requires to do anything genuinely better.